And we're off.
Civil rights leader, theologian, and mystic, and educator Howard Thurman wrote, "Community cannot feed for long on itself. It will only flourish where always the boundaries are giving way to the coming of others from beyond, those unknown and undiscovered brothers and sisters." Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman believed in the power of religion to bring together people, to harmonize human relations so that Black, brown, and white people would find each other and be together and work together in ways that make us come alive. Welcome to the Thurman Conversations for 2021. Moving into our second year, we will spend the first couple of months exploring the intersection of faith and food and how we can address food insecurity as we work towards racial justice. Our second conversation partner of the year brings us into the world of agricultural chaplaincy, grain, and bread. Elizabeth DeRuff is an agricultural chaplain with the Episcopal Church, a businesswoman and a farmer who makes her home in Marin County. Elizabeth grows and sources two varieties of heirloom wheat, which are stone milled and available for sale from Honore Farm and Mill. She also directs a CSA, community-sponsored agriculture, that provides flour for churches and synagogues. She is a sourdough lover and a spontaneous thinker, so anything could happen here tonight. We will continue our format from last year. We will hear from Elizabeth for about 40 minutes. During that time, you will all be muted, but we invite you to add questions in the chat. We will gather those questions for the last 20 minutes or so and give Elizabeth time to respond to as many as time allows. So if anything comes up for you, please put those in the chat. A special thank you to our mission partners, the Race Task Force for the Episcopal Church in Colorado and St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Lakewood, and our producer, Michelle Auerbach. My name is Alan Cole. I will be our host for the evening. Before we begin, we need to say that the Thurman Conversations come to you from the unceded territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. We acknowledge those communities, their elders, their stories, past and present, and the emerging future that dismantles the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Elizabeth, welcome to the Thurman Conversations.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you and to be part of this conversation, this ongoing conversation.
Tell us about Honore Farms.
Yeah, so 5 years ago, I created a nonprofit that's really interested in transforming our food and farm systems by recognizing the regenerative properties, both in the land and within ourselves. And, you know, I think what's important to us is that we work with nature rather than against nature, because so much of our food and farm systems work against natural processes, and there's so much destruction. And if we can work with nature, we can, I think, we create this exchange and this reciprocity and sort of re-situate ourselves into relationship with the land and with food and with God. And so Honore Farm and Mill does all of this by farming organically. We are cultivating rare organic heritage grains, and we offer experiential education.
So tell us about your work as an agricultural chaplain.
Yeah, it's a wonderful title. I am also an Episcopal priest, and I've found that the title agricultural chaplain just creates this conversation because no one really knows what it is. And in fact, my journal a few years ago, I titled it, Learning to Become an Agricultural Chaplain. So it's an ongoing vocation. And it comes from England, actually. I was given a grant by our diocese to do some research in farming. And I wanted to know what the Church of England was doing with farming, because in England, they've been farming a tad longer than we have been. And it happened that my 1 week stay over there doing research, I'd contacted a center that worked with farmers sort of in the Midlands area. And the day I was going to be there was the day of the annual agricultural chaplains meeting. Like it only happened once a year, and I happened to be there. So they graciously invited me, and it was this spectacular group of priests and lay people that were serving the farming community. And I just felt like I was with kindred souls. This was like 15 years ago. So when I came back, I had a conversation with my bishop, and I asked him for his blessing to use that title. So that's where agricultural chaplaincy comes from.
So I'd never heard of this. And I want to know, this is kind of personal. You said how you sort of found your way into this. But what gave you the desire to do this? I mean, we say led and called all the time, but where does this come from out of you?
Mm-hmm. You know, where it comes from is, I think, two personal experiences. The first one was back in 2003 when I took over being our diocesan chaplain for our family camp, which was a week-long camp up at a camp and conference center in wine country, and 110 people for the week. And it was my first year as the chaplain, although I'd been going for many years. And at the very first Eucharist, everybody's in their swimsuits and we're acting out the gospel stories. And it's just an amazing group of people. And, I was giving communion, and I tried to give a piece of bread to a woman, and she leaned over and she said, I can't eat that because I'm allergic to bread. And that was in 2003. And, that was pastorally concerning to me, but I thought it was sort of a one-off. This is just one person. And we figured out, how to take care of that with rice crackers. But then over the years, sort of the idea of gluten intolerance and, wheat intolerance started to become more well-known. And then, so that was sort of something that lodged in my mind, because I do have farming in my background. Both my parents are from the Midwest, and they both have had some farming in their childhood experiences. And I think that the second thing was I was working as a vicar of a congregation, and there was a piece of land that I passed almost every single day. In fact, my gym was right across the street from it. And I parked my car, and it was a vacant lot of 16 acres of an old plant nursery. And I kept looking at it, and I started spending more time looking at it, more time studying it each time I would go to my gym. And the only thing I could say is I feel like I was called by that piece of land. And we worked for 2 years to endeavor to create an educational farm school on that property that actually ended up not working out. But through the process of working on that project, I met a grain farmer who told me that people with gluten issues could actually eat the kind of wheat he was farming. And it was sort of that moment, and this was 2010, so 11 years ago. And, what happened at the altar, and then hearing about grains, I just connected those dots, and I thought, the place where food and the land meet the church most directly is on our altar table in the form of bread and wine, two agricultural crops. And I just became fascinated and just started taking university classes and just reading everything I could, going to conferences, having individual meetings with farmers. And I just, I continue to this day just to feel so curious. I feel like it's really my most authentic calling, and it's just really exciting because I continue to learn, and I'm sure I'm going to learn from this conversation today too, and by being part of these conversations.
Well, we'll learn from you, I know. So you talk about it as it's been so transformative for you. How do you believe it'll change or it can change our faith communities?
Well, I think look, I'm gonna kind of explore this. First of all, as you had mentioned at the beginning, so we grow our own heirloom grains, and I also work with small farmers. And then we create a share for churches. And so they purchase the share at the beginning of the year, and they are distributed grain 4 times a year. And that goes to the churches, and the bread bakers there then use that flour to break communion bread. And even during COVID, communities are still doing that. Not all of them, but the ones that are baking at home, they are baking small little loaves, and then volunteers pick up those loaves and deliver them to churches. And I've probably, of all the Bay Area churches that are participating in our CSA, I probably have preached at every single one of them. So, and way longer that, and I also teach a class too, sort of about the history between the church and wheat and bread. And I think so that's one way that we're actually getting this grain into churches. But we're measuring the impact. These old heirloom grains have deeper roots, so they sequester or draw down carbon from the atmosphere. So we're measuring how much carbon we are sequestering. And we did a study. We went to General Convention, the last 2 General Conventions, and supplied all the communion bread. Sorry for you non-Episcopalians, that is our triennial conference. Um, and at that, we were reporting that now this is just the Episcopal Church, but if every Episcopal church was to source an heirloom variety of grains, which would be organically farmed by small farmers and remain local, we could sequester 100 million pounds of carbon every single year. So that's
Wow.
significant. The other thing, I mean, it's part of a much larger conversation, which is sort of what has happened to bread? Why did Jesus leave, ask us to remember him by bread, by sharing bread? And I think that that's actually a really interesting sort of intersection of trying to understand why Jesus asked us to remember him by sharing bread, to what is bread today and how that has changed, because bread has not changed for the better. And,
Mm.
if you look back to first century Palestine, um, you know, food, there was no refrigeration, there was no Costco, there was no, you know, uh, vast supplies of food. People understood that outside of their villages where they saw wheat and their other foods and their lamb, grazing, that was their food supply. So they knew, they were intimately linked to the land. They knew that when it was dry and or there was a drought, they would go hungry, which means some people would die. So
Mm.
it wasn't something that is so casual, I think, today, how we think about food, and that it's plentiful and it's always there and we waste it. And we just have a very different relationship with food. And so for Jesus and his followers, he could have chosen a lot of different breads. He could have chosen fish. He could have chosen olives. He could have chosen figs, whatever. And I think the context of why he chose that and how the church has maintained that as one of the central features of being together, and what we do in our families, hopefully every night to break bread together. He chose bread because it's very easy to grow. You can store it. So if once it's harvested and you clean the grain, you can store it, which is not true with a lot of other foods. It's also incredibly nutritious. So when historically we would say people could live by bread and water alone, that was true. It's like this perfect package of vitamins, minerals, healthy fats, fiber, protein. It's also delicious.
Mm.
And so and one of the interesting things about bread in that time, so they ate more bread than any other food. And it was available to rich and poor, because we have, the mandate in Leviticus that in that culture, if you owned land and you were growing grain, you had to keep part of the crop unharvested for the poor. So everyone had access to food, to grain and to bread. And so I think for Jesus' hearers, the people, it would have been, when he said, I am the bread of life, he was saying, I am as important to you spiritually as bread is to you physically. And that would have not been lost on anyone. And I think that today that would not be true. That in some ways, hearing I am the bread of life for modern ears, do people even know what that means, or the importance of that, or the symbolism of it too, the reality and the symbolism?
Well, you talk about it with such passion, and you mentioned the spiritual connection. So I got to say, what are we really hungry for?
Mm.
I was going to let you answer that.
Well, it's a really good question. And as I think about this work, it is completely changed my own spirituality. And I think you asked the question previous to this, like what are the opportunities of the church? And I think that there's things from every religious tradition that we could bring to bear, but I'm just going to speak about the Christian tradition, that we have this idea of a sacrament, which is an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual truth. So really what that means to me is that the material world and the spiritual world are one. And there's this great quote that I wanted to share by Robert Capon, who was a priest in the 20th century. And he said, we have this terrible habit that plagues so many spiritual minds to imagine that matter and spirit are somehow at odds with each other. And so I think this idea of sacramental living, that when we are in the presence of a tree, we recognize that there is there's a sacredness to that. It's God's creation. And so I think that hunger is that we keep making food cheaper and cheaper. I mean, on a nutritional level, we really are hungry because the food we're growing now is not as nutritious as it used to be. And that's primarily because we're not taking care of our soil. Because if the nutrients aren't in the soil, they're not going to be in the plant, and they're not going to be in us. So we're shopping in the middle aisles, buying calcium and, buying little bottles of our nutrients now. And so I think we're hungry for food that really is nourishing. I think for me, I know I'm hungry for food that is truly nourishing and healthy. I'm hungry for, I think, a sense of what farming has given me, which is such a connection to the land, and having that encounter with the mystery of something that's growing, that no matter how many prayers I say, that is growing. And it's really, I think it's important to stay grounded with nature and with the land, because ultimately that is God's witness to us.
So I was going to move next into faith and environment.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us what's your view on that and how it comes together for you.
Well, one idea that I am fond of is actually rephrasing that word environment that feels kind of chilly, to talking about the living world. Because I feel like the environment kind of objectifies it, where the living world, which we are a part of, we are animals, and really, I mean, human animals, part of this whole interconnection. So what are the spiritual practices that we have that remind us of that interconnection? What are our cautionary tales that remind us not to overconsume? I think those kinds of questions and exploring those is invaluable.
Um, I wanted to ask you about the food justice movement and regenerative agriculture.
Mhm,
Tell us about that.
mhm. Well, I think there's been an interesting conversation going on just in the last couple of weeks. Regenerative agriculture is this idea of holistic farming. So it pays attention to not just the soil, not just the crops, but it pays attention to who is actually farming that land for us and what is their exposure to toxins. It pays attention to rotational grazing, which is farming really with nature in the sense of using the fertility of animals to then fertilize the soil. And rather than how industrial farming has really separated those two things, we have sort of these CAFOs, these high concentrated feed lots for animals, and then we have monocrop farms. We've separated those two, and we've created two problems. We have too much fertility here and not enough on the farm. And so regenerative ag is saying, let's bring these things back together. But I think one of the interesting things about justice in this conversation is that there are a lot of people like me, a lot of white people talking about this. And what's really important to remember is that every single indigenous, I think, culture around the world knew this and had an intimate connection with the land and understood this idea of the cycle of nature and fertility and how our food impacts our community, and this sense of food is a gift and not to waste that. So I think that that's where food justice, really recognizing the indigenous communities that actually brought us that, as well as many of the Black farmers during slavery had their own small lot of, to farm, and they did not have the privilege of fertilizers or fancy equipment. They had to figure it out. And, because they were so connected to the land, they brought a lot of wisdom to this movement too. And I think it's really important that we remember that.
So you talk about, I love the phrase you used a minute ago instead of environment. Can you repeat that? What did you say?
The living world,
Living,
the living
the
world.
living world.
I really try
That-
hard because the environment I just feel this immediate separation, don't you?
well, it feels it feels a little pointedly political,
Mm.
which is perfectly fine if it doesn't shut us down and stop the conversation. But the living world, man, I mean, how can you? We're talking about stewardship, right? So I love
I
that.
want to stop you there in terms of stewardship because I think that is an interesting question. And something I've thought a lot about. And I think, as I mentioned in the introduction about Honore Farm and Mill, I'm very interested in this sense of the regenerative capacities that are in the land, in the sense that there is, and it's what regenerative organic farming is trying to do, which is basically that the land is not just sustaining, it's actually regenerating, rebuilding, renewing, regrowing. And I think that what's interesting about that is the land and humans are actually, we take care of each other. It's mutual. It's not like we are stewarding the land. It's that the land stewards us and we steward the land. And the wiser we become about with each other, the more we can work with that natural flow and the principles that are true. For example, in compost, we know that when we compost dead matter becomes future fertility. So that is a principle that also has spiritual implications too.
So your passion for this is pretty obvious. Now I want to talk about you and your grain. Tell us why local grain. First, tell us why local grain is so important to you.
Mm. Well, I think local grain is so important to me because I feel like it's sort of the good news out of this movement as we're talking about climate change. So local grain, first of all, we probably all know that agriculture accounts for 30% of all greenhouse gases. And that's primarily because of the petroleum-based fertilizers that off gas. So we're talking about a large part of contributing to climate change, our food and farm systems. Second of all, within food and farm systems, wheat consumes more acres around the globe than any other human crop, not animal or ethanol like corn, but human crops. So you're talking about the potential of, if we can change the way wheat is grown, we can make an enormous difference. And there's some different there's many levels of why it's so important. First of all, in industrial farming, you're talking about seeds that are patented by corporations. And what a patented seed means is that a farmer each year has to go back to that seed company and purchase their seed, whereby just 100 years ago, this is a new phenomenon. Just 150 years ago, farmers planted their grain, and then from their harvest, they replanted the next year. And I think that's another example of sort of this God-given inheritance of the abundance of nature, that life begets life. And so this idea of patenting seed means that corporations own that life. So I think that that's really important. So we practice something called seed sovereignty, which is we only work with grain that is open source, that is not patented. Secondly, the amount of varieties of grain, there are about 150,000 varieties of grain, and we farm, like on a commercial level, a couple dozen. And as our climate warms, those grains are not going to give us all the genetic makeup that we need to keep up with a warming climate. So we're very interested in recovering some of these very old grains that have amazing stories in there, mostly in food banks. In seed banks. And so if a grain is in seed bank, it stays stagnant. But if you put it in the ground, it all of a sudden comes to life and becomes more intelligent. So each year it learns the environment in which it's living in. And we call those kinds of grains landrace grains, like human race, because they grow and more intelligent each year that they're farmed. And so I feel like it's critical to get as many of these grains out of our food banks and get them back into production. And if you could bear with me, I would love to tell you about one of them that we are trying.
Please, yes.
In fact, I have some right here. This is called Harani. And you can see it has, see these spikes on it? Those are actually called awns. It's a self-planting mechanism of the grain. I mean, I just think it's really a beautiful, beautiful wheat. The Harani came to us via the Bread Lab at Washington State University. They've been supporters of ours, and the chief farmer there just really likes what we're doing. And he actually went to a seed bank and got this Harani seed for us, and he grew it out and sent me 2 years ago, he sent me a half a baggie of the seeds. And we planted those 2 years ago, and we went to 13 pounds. And then this last year, even during COVID, we planted the 13 and we got 150 pounds. And I think we may have more Harani seed than any other farmer in the world. And if I'm wrong, I would love to know that. And the interesting part about Harani is that it's actually a seed that's 2,000 years old. It was buried in the year 74 CE or AD because a group of Jews during the Great Revolt in the first century, a group of Jews, they were being attacked by the Romans as the Romans were sort of serially killing off the different Jewish encampments. And this group of Jews called Sicarii were at the Masada fortress in Israel. And if any of you have been there, I'm very jealous because I haven't been there. but they knew they were going to be overtaken by the Romans. And so they took all of their food and they put it into a storehouse and they burned it in the year 74 AD or CE.
Mm.
And then they were all, they actually committed mass suicide, but they didn't want to leave anything for the Romans. And then in 1960, some archaeologists discovered this storehouse of food at the Masada Fortress. So not until like almost 2,000 years old. And they discovered salt and wine and oil, wheat, Harani, even a date that still had flesh on it, 2,000 years old. So this
Wow.
Harani comes from, I just think, it gives me chills. I think about, when we feel so hopeless and we might be burning everything and feeling like there is no end. I just think if those Sakari Jews ever could have imagined 2,000 years later, this grain would be resurrected and come into, that we would learn their story and plant that grain. I think it's an incredible story. And
It
it's
really
so
is.
delicious. It is so
Yeah, I was
delicious.
going to ask you, what does it taste like? How would you describe it?
Well, of all the different varieties of wheat, there are, durums that are good for pasta. There are bread wheats that tend to have a higher protein level. There are pastry wheats that are softer, so there's so many different varieties. So there's different characteristics for baking, but even within those, like of the different durums, this is a durum. They taste so different. Like Sonora is very buttery and rich, and it's a pastry flour. Red Fife is just, it's nutty and savory and gives this dimension to bread. And then the Harani, I've only baked with it once because we had such a small amount of seed. And we did a little Harani tasting party, COVID friendly, this last year. And we tasted 3 different breads, and just touching it, it just felt different. It felt so springy and just easy to work with. And it's the kind of wheat that I think you could eat every single day and never get tired of it.
Wow. So I know that our producer, Michelle Auerbach, you can tell that she was started doing this when you were
Oh,
talking about our grain grinder is going all the time. So you got us both our mouths watering.
great.
So I know you teach the art of baking bread
Mhm.
to bring people into this practice. Tell us about that.
Well, I've done it in a number of different venues and I love, love, love doing it. It started out in church kitchens, teaching different bread baking communities how to bake bread. But what I realized in doing that is that most of the churches where I've taught, the bread bakers have actually never gotten together as a whole group. So they have baked in their kitchens, and it's very much like a lot of women's work. We do that out of sight in our homes. And so I felt like just bringing that teaching to the churches and collecting that group of people, something was birthed in that. And I think that that's something, whether you're in a church community or not, being in a kitchen with people and baking bread, um, and learning together. I know that that's really fantastic too, because we did a Kickstarter in 2016 to purchase our own mill that's transportable. It's called a mobile mill. And we brought that for educational reasons. And to raise the money, we did a Kickstarter and people donated money to have a bread baking class in their homes. And that has continued. And they're just so much fun to do. And I do a lot of education about, why whole grain is more nutritious, labeling issues of why it's hard to know how to choose good flour. And Oh, and so I was going to say during COVID, we realized we couldn't do any of that in person. So I've started an online course called Rising with Elizabeth, and I was getting so many questions about sourdough, so I put together a tutorial on how to take care of sourdough bread, sourdough, and then how to bake bread. And then since then, we've made sourdough scones. And then most recently, I did a pie crust for Thanksgiving. And it's really, it's just this whole world to discover. And it's so much fun to do it in a group.
Like, you talk about the joy of it, and tell us how our communities can take this on and see it um, as a spiritual practice where they sort of gather life, a life-giving task. Talk
Mm.
to us about how we can do that.
Well, here, I think one of the, and if I could do this on Zoom, I would. So here is a loaf of bread that I made today. This is a combination of three different varieties of wheat. It's einkorn, which I've actually never baked with, and Sonora and red fife. And I told you when it was baking today, it was like all I could do to not cut into it because it just smelled, it still smells, it smells so good. And my husband and I are definitely cutting into that at after this is
In
over.
just a few minutes.
Yeah.
Well, I gotta say, I want to say, if you could hold that up one more time. Can you
Oh,
hold the bread up
sure.
one more time?
Yeah.
So that just
And
so
it's
our
really,
producer and I,
hmm?
go ahead. That,
I,
look at the ears, Michelle Auerbach. Look at the ears on that bread. That's pretty awesome.
actually, you know
Okay,
what I can
sorry.
do? Just, I don't know if I can because it's kind of hard, but I am gonna, I'm breaking it. You can see the
Oh,
inside.
wow.
Well, I'm not gonna be able to go through that crust, but there's the inside of the loaf. And I think what's I'm gonna get to I'm gonna answer your question, but I'm gonna, by way of, I think when you're sort of in the 70s, when people started the back to the land and homesteading became popular again. It's not that it was for the first time, but when it became popular, I think we were working with wheat that was roller milled, which is a different form of milling. And, it creates a really bitter, dense loaf. And so I think for a lot of people that think about whole wheat bread, I only baked with 100% whole wheat bread or whole grain bread, they think, ugh, I don't want that. And these new varieties are just nothing like that. Just nothing like that. So how do we get our communities? So what was your question? Sorry.
You were talking about it with such joy and your community coming together to bake bread and your teaching. And I wanted to know about how you would guide us into taking this on as a spiritual practice, and how we can support each other in the connection that these heritage grains give us, a spiritual connection that we probably don't have now with wafers. And you know tell us how to get more spiritual, if
Mm.
that's the way to look at it in our bread practices.
Well, one of the ways, just a practical way, is your church could either form a CSA or your community. During COVID, because churches have actually stopped meeting, as I've said, some of them are using the grain. We've had this explosion of home bakers join our CSA. So people are now getting distributions of flour every quarter, and enough, it wouldn't last me a year because I bake more than once a week probably, but this is enough wheat really that you can bake one loaf every single week of the year, or you can bake other things and not just bake bread. But I think what's happened in the church community is when we send out that flour, we send meditations with the flour. And I try to support the bakers with spiritual reflection. We also offer a seed blessing so that all of the participating churches, and it'd be interesting to do with home bakers too. We send them, so last year we sent them a little baggie of these precious Harani seeds. And for the churches, this is before COVID, they would put them on their altar and bless them, and then they would mail the seeds back to us. And so in the spring, we took those seeds and we mixed them in with all the seeds that were planted. So, I mean, I would love to see something where we're distributing seeds, and like maybe when we have enough Harani, distribute seeds to anyone who wants them. And you could put them in a pot. You could put them in a little patch of grass. I mean, it's very easy to grow. Grain is a grass. And so that would be a really interesting experiment, and to talk to each other. How's your grain growing this week? And that's what I noticed with the, the first action I took was working with an underserved school, an elementary school, probably 12 years ago, and called Wheat Wednesdays. And I taught them how to grow grain. And it was the first time I had ever actually done it myself. So learn by doing, go and plant some.
I can see it now. The Lord be with you. How's your grain?
Exactly. Yeah.
We're gonna open it up to questions in just a moment, but some of your comments brought up questions for me. You talked about climate change. Have you noticed a difference in Marin County since you've been there in the last few years? Do you see climate change affecting your growing season or your yields, or what do you see?
Well, I know you're in Colorado, but you probably all heard about the fires we've been having over the last few years. And last year's fire was terrifying. It was within a half a mile of our farm. We actually harvested. We have this amazing event, and anyone is welcome to come to it. We have a grain planting. So this is where our experiential education happens. Actually, in March, we'll be having a community plant where we plant together in the morning, and then we all share a meal. COVID friendly. We did it last year. And then in the summer, we have harvest, and the harvest is sort of our biggest event of the year. It's so much fun. People learn how to harvest with a sickle, thresh, winnow, mill, and then we sit down to a beautiful farm lunch. And in both of those events, I bring bread like this, and we share that bread. But we harvested last year. We had our harvest celebration on August 15th. And that night, I mean, it was like God was looking out for us. That night, the lightning started, and next day the fire started. And it was also 105 degrees that day that we harvested. The heat has been just that was absolutely the hottest harvest. And I've been doing this for 7 years. The hottest harvest we've ever had. And it was exhausting. And so the next morning, everybody that knew about we hadn't finished all of the job. And so the next morning, I was like back up there exhausted because the fires had started and we had to get that grain out of the field. So the smoke was terrible. And that's happening because our lands are getting drier and drier. So when there is some spark, there's more fuel. And so we're having these like super fires. And a lot of that is that we have actually foregone the ancient practice that actually happened in California way before us white people were here, that, the indigenous people of California always burned their lands. They did preventative burns, always. Like 5 million acres were burned every single year, which really cut down on fires. So we need to do more of that. And I know it's controversial, but a little bit of smoke managed is way better than what we went through. It was weeks and weeks and weeks where we could not go outside.
Well, we were watching you because it was happening here as well. I mean, I think you
Right.
guys got hit quite a bit harder. But yeah, it's frightening. It was frightening for us. Parishioners of ours were within a half a mile of a fire. I mean, it's just, it starts to get pretty scary when it's not in some other place.
Right. So
So,
if you think about why is the planet getting warmer? The planet's getting warmer because we're creating more greenhouse gases. And
mhm,
then, just linking back to what we talked about earlier, I mean, the greenhouse gases, 1/3 of them are produced by farming. And
mhm,
so we can 3 times a day make choices about what we purchase. And the more we can purchase local, the more we can purchase organic, the more we can purchase seeds that are, food that have been grown from open source seeds, the more we are actually helping climate change. And I think sadly, um, to purchase organically, to purchase, heirloom grain, all of these things, it takes resources. And, our low income communities can't afford that. And that would be a real vision and goal of mine, which would be to make this kind of grain available to everyone. And the
mhm.
more people that can afford it buy it, the more we can employ farmers to farm it, and the more farmers we have, the more economy of scale we can achieve, and therefore the prices can drop. So, I just hope we continue to create interest in churches. I hope we continue to create interest in bread bakers and in bakeries, to continue to demand this kind of healthy grain, that's good for the earth and good for us.
So we have a question that is, do these types of grain take less water to grow?
Such a good question. Thank you so much. So if you imagine at the Masada Fortress, which I've never been to, but it's on a
Mhm,
2,000-foot cliff in a very, very arid area of Israel, which by and large is, they had no irrigation. So historically, grain was grown dry farmed, which means no irrigation. And in our area, the Russian River Valley, which is sort of Sonoma County wine country,
mhm,
Sonora, which is the oldest North American grain, was grown for the people that came for the gold rush. So, and there was no irrigation then. So all of the farmers we work with and contract with grow grain without irrigation.
mhm.
So
So I have a question and a
they
self-serving
use less,
follow-up.
they use less water. Is
Good.
my answer.
So a question is, how can we get some of this grain at our churches, and more importantly, how can we get some at my house?
Well, I do know that there are some grain growers in Colorado. I don't know all of them, but maybe you can put up something in your chat about those. We grow different grains in California. We actually have sort of the ideal environment for growing these. So back up. It originates in the Fertile Crescent, which is, Iraq, Israel, that area. And so our area in California is probably most similar to that Mediterranean climate. So we can grow almost any wheat here. So we do have access to a wider variety. We can grow a wider variety here. So I would love it if anyone wanted to join our CSA or just try some of our flour, or as a church, you can join. And then maybe once you join and get the rhythm of it, maybe you can create something on a local level, which we did actually in Michigan. I think Sue Salinger, your speaker last, or your conversationalist last time, talked about Plainsong Farm. So
Yeah.
we Honorary Farm and Mill, we applied for a creation care grant, which we were given, and then we asked communities who was interested in learning how to create a grain CSA. And the priest who runs that farm contacted us and said, "Oh, choose me." So we spent about a year flying out to Michigan and showing them how to plant. And we created a planting day for them and a harvest day. And so now she's off and running and creating a grain CSA. But, I think that takes a huge commitment of someone like myself or that priest. Joining our CSA is just a way to get it kickstarted and a way to employ farmers and a way to get these healthy grains and this conversation going. So that's probably the easiest way to start. And then I hope that it deepens, and I hope that people kind of get bit by the bug.
So we our producers put in information about Colorado grain growers
Great.
in our chat. So I think one of our questions is, we often think of a CSA as something we do during the summertime. Is this a year-round thing? How does this work with a grain CSA?
Yeah, good question. So we are slightly different than a regular CSA, which is community supported agriculture, where you make an investment at the beginning of the season. And then if it's a bumper crop, you get a lot of harvest over the summer. And if it's not so good, you don't get as much. And that is a great financing tool for farmers because it puts the burden of nature on a whole group rather than just on the farmer. We have created a slightly different version of that, where we provide a set amount of flour, which again is depending on a group size. You can buy a quarter share, half share, full share for churches, and then we have full shares for individuals. And it's a set amount of pounds of grain. And we freshly mill that each quarter and we mail it out to either individuals or churches. And then you can keep it fresh either in your refrigerator or freezer. So we distribute that 4 times a year, each season of the year.
So is it just flour, or can someone buy grain, just grain?
Yeah, we historically have distributed flour, and I would say 99% of what we distribute is flour, but we also could distribute grain.
Okay. I have just from my own experience is at communion, we often have people who prefer a gluten-free wafer, and because most of the time we bake our own bread. So if somebody comes to us and says, can I try this grain? Is this different? Is my gluten intolerance gonna keep me from enjoying this or make me sick? How could I talk to people about that? How could we?
Well, and I don't know if you already do this, but first of all, I don't have the funding to run a scientific experiment. And if I did, I would. However, there are studies that show people, even with very extreme gluten intolerance, can tolerate like einkorn, which is the grandmother of all grains, the simplest form, which I mentioned that the bread I have was partially baked from. It's a challenging grain though to bake bread from because the protein is different in it. It doesn't have a great rise. But the way you can talk about it is, I speak about it anecdotally. I can't even tell you how many people write to me and say they're gluten intolerant and they try our grains and they're like, I cannot believe I can eat bread again. So I'm just thrilled about that. And, all I can say is anecdotally, that is true. But I also can say that the seeds are different. They are an old landrace variety of seed. So the quality of the seed is different than modern wheat, which has been genetically changed so that part of the wheat that creates white flour, the endosperm, is larger. So these old wheats have not done that. And it's organically farmed. So who knows if somebody's not tolerating glyphosate. And also the stone milling makes a huge difference. So when you stone mill grain, and some of this is on Rising with Elizabeth in the sourdough class. So if you want to go and look at that, it's available online on our website. Because I'm kind of racing through. Milling is really important because 100% of the grain goes in the hopper and 100% comes out in flour. And that is not true with commercial whole wheat flour. Commercial whole wheat flour is roller milled, which means that it's been separated into 3 different compartments and then recombined, and they never recombine 100% of that grain. And in fact, labeling, so commercial whole wheat bread only has to be, or whole wheat flour only has to be 51% whole wheat. So the portion of white flour that most people have their gluten intolerance to is because the white flour is made only by one part, the endosperm, and that is where the gluten is. So when you're eating white flour, it has a larger percent of gluten, and you're not getting the fiber and the B vitamins that are underneath the fiber and the aleuron level, and you're not getting the healthy oils. So when these things are stone milled all together, it creates this very digestible flour. And then in addition to that, if you bake with sourdough, sourdough further pre-digests the gluten. So the lactobacillus in the sourdough makes the gluten, it breaks it down. And so it makes it very digestible. So if you bake sourdough communion bread, all the better.
Well, that was our next question. So thank you for answering that. We are coming close to the end of our time, and I have a sourdough pizza to eat when this is over.
Ooh,
So
great.
your passion for this is very intoxic. Thank you.
Toxic?
Yeah, intoxic, not toxic. It's like, it's just so interesting, and nobody thinks about bread as intoxicating is what I meant. It's
Oh,
just
intoxicate.
nobody's yeah.
Oh,
It's just so different than how we think. And we're Episcopalians and liturgical communities use wafers a lot of time. It's just not, it feels so removed from what Jesus would have done. So thank you for taking the time to be with us.
you're welcome. I wanted to close on one other thought. It's a rumination
Please.
that I find so fascinating, is that I was reading a quote by Wendell Berry, and he was talking about this amnesia that we have about forgetting about food, forgetting about where it comes from, forgetting that people are actually tending this land, and our industrial food supply wants us to forget that. They don't want us to see where our chickens are grown, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he talked about this amnesia, and it made me think about when I was in seminary. I'm kind of geeking out here. I wrote a paper as a senior thesis on this idea of amnesis, which is basically something that is, it's the phrase of, do this in remembrance of me. So it's amnesis is the remembrance. And it's so interesting to me that it's the one time that we know of that Jesus said, remember me. All the other times, remember, he's saying, don't tell anyone, don't tell anyone. So he's saying, remember me when you break bread. And I think just that thought about amnesis and amnesia, they're from the same root, and they mean they're, different things. So,
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who joined us tonight. Our next conversation is on February the 11th with Fatima Ahmad and Damian Thompson. Fatima and Damian are the co-founders of Frontline Farming, a Black-owned agricultural community engaged in food production and education along the Front Range here in Colorado. They grow high-quality organic food, which supports fair wages for farmers and is distributed to a network of restaurants and institutional purchasers with sliding scale sales at farm stands and donations to a variety of nonprofit partners. Fatima and Damian are both educators who engage a range of individuals, from elders and toddlers, in ethical and sustainable growing practices that enhance the land and foster community connections. They are also conveners of Project Protect Food Systems, organizing around justice and food systems workers during COVID and beyond. So join us on February the 11th at 7 p.m. Elizabeth, how can we find you?
you can find us so the name of the organization is Honore Farm and Mill, and our website is honoremill.org. But if you type in either, you'll find us.
And that is in our chat, I believe. It is. The Thurman Conversations series is sponsored by the Race Task Force of the Episcopal Church in Colorado and St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Lakewood, and produced by Michelle Auerbach. Elizabeth, again, thank you so much for being with us. And for all you folks, as always, if you like what you hear here, don't tell us, tell your friends. Stay safe, love your neighbor, and wear a mask. In fact, wear 2 masks. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.